All right, welcome everybody to your hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Barclay Group, our monthly webinar series, and we're thrilled to have you with us this month. And our webinar this month is actually brought to you in conjunction with APA North Carolina, so we're happy to have them in partnership with us, and thank you to Hannah Cochran for helping us plan this month's webinar. Before we get started on this month's webinar, just a few reminders and a couple announcements that we do on the regular. As a reminder, this month and next month are a week early due to the holidays. So please mark your calendars for next month, December 13th, and join us for our upcoming webinar. If you haven't registered already, you can find it at virginia.planning.org and you can register. Making sense of the trends and traps in Virginia's 2020 census data that's being presented on December 13th from noon to 1 p.m. By Weldon Cooper Center at the University of Virginia. So we hope you'll join us for that. Again, you can go ahead and register for that. As always, all of our webinar series are recorded and they can be found on our YouTube page. This one is being recorded today, and all of our registrants will get an email after the webinar is over and posted about where they can find it, as well as information about upcoming webinars, CM credits, and all other announcements from the APA Virginia chapter. Again, thank you to our sponsors, the Barclay Group, for making this webinar series possible. And this month, thank you to APA North Carolina for helping us make this particular Cycling for Sustainable Cities possible. Before we get started with our two presenters, a couple quick housekeeping notes. Again, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can submit your questions to our presenters through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We may run a little bit longer. Normally our presentations are an hour each month, but our presentation this month is so exciting that our Q&A may go a little bit over the hour. So we encourage you to stay as long as you are able. We're going to wrap up by about 1:15. Again, it is being recorded if you do have to drop off, but we're going to take the Q&A from about 1 to 1:15. So we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the session in the Q&A box. We'll take those questions afterwards. And then as we move into that portion, we will monitor those questions and take them as they came in. If you'd like to ask a question live, you can use the raise the hand function, and I will allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question live to our presenters. So with that, I want to give them as much time to present to you as possible. So I will introduce you to Ralph Buehler, is the professor and chair of the Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech's Research Center in Arlington, Virginia. And John Pucher is the professor emeritus in the School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And I'm sorry, I totally just stumbled over that. So because I'm trying to talk fast enough so they have enough time to present to you, because they have stressed to me how awesome their presentation is today. So at this point, I'm just going to hand it over to these awesome gentlemen who I've worked with for over the past couple of weeks to bring this presentation to you that they have done all over the world, Cycling for Sustainable Cities, and let them chat with you, and we'll take questions at the end. So gentlemen, that is the quickest intro I've ever done. It is on to you all.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you to everyone for joining us this early afternoon. John and I would like to thank the Virginia chapter of APA for hosting this webinar and the North Carolina chapter for co-sponsoring it. We'd also like to thank the New Jersey, the Maryland, the Georgia, the Tennessee, and the Texas chapters for helping making this webinar accessible to their members. And as this webinar is a collaboration, the content we're going to present to you today is also a collaboration. It's based on a book that John and I edited with 45 contributors from 5 continents with expertise in bicycling in the areas of planning, engineering, public health, and geography. The main idea of the presentation and the book is to identify how to make city cycling safe and convenient for everyone. And you can already see that on the title slide here, what some of the measures are to promote cycling for men as well as for women, for young people, for older individuals, and for all races and ethnicities. This is carried through to the cover of the book, where we have this cover photo here. This is mass bicycling in Amsterdam. This is not an event, this is daily cycling there. We see different people riding bikes. We see them dressed in ordinary daily clothes. We see ordinary bicycles. Some of them are cargo bikes to carry cargo or carry luggage. And then, of course, we have a green light here on the right-hand side for a green bicycle signal. The next couple of slides, I'm quickly going to talk about the different chapters of the book, and then John will start us into the presentation. So first, we provide an overview of cycling and sustainability internationally, and then we focus on chapters with various topics that are important for bicycling, like cycling and health, bicycling safety, and bicycling infrastructure for making cycling accessible for everyone. This is followed by a chapter on bicycle parking, because bicycles are parked most of the time, as cars are, by the way. Then we have a chapter looking at non-infrastructure programs and policies that promote bicycling. This is followed by a chapter looking at how can we evaluate bike policies and prioritize different projects. Then we have two chapters on technology and bicycling. One is on e-bikes and the growth of e-bikes, bike usage in Europe and North America. And the next one is on bike sharing and its ongoing evolution. The next chapters focus on different groups of society and cycling, starting with women in cycling, children in cycling, and then older adults in bicycling. And these three chapters are sort of bookended by a chapter on the importance of social justice and cycling to make cycling feasible and accessible for everyone. The next part of the book has case studies on cycling, starting with the two most populous countries in the world, cycling in China and in India, followed by cycling in Latin America in a chapter. And then we have city case studies. The first is looking at large cities, New York City, London, and Paris compared. This is followed by the two large bicycling legacy cities in Europe, Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And we're comparing them in a chapter there. The next chapter looks at relative newcomers to bicycling, Portland, Oregon, and Seville in Spain compared. The second to the last chapter focuses on bicycling advocacy in Europe, North America, and Australia. And then in the last chapter, John and I provide an outlook for cycling in the future. And now we can take off and get really into the presentation. Over to John.
As you might expect from the title of the book, cycling is a very important theme that runs throughout the book. In fact, every single one of the 21 chapters deals with sustainability in at least one dimension, and normally in 3 or 4 or 5 different dimensions. This slide sort of categorizes 3 of the aspects of sustainability. The environmental sustainability of cycling is probably the most obvious to you. Cycling doesn't really involve any pollution. It doesn't use much in the way of non-renewable resources. So it's certainly environmentally sustainable. Economically, sustainability, it's very low in private costs. Almost anyone can afford some sort of a bike. And it's very, very low and very inexpensive in terms of public costs. Especially compared to other means of transportation. It certainly is less expensive than building expanded roadways, or it's also, I'm a big fan of public transit, but it's also less expensive than building new public transit lines. It's also economical and sustainable in that dimension from the point of view of improving health, and by doing that, reducing medical costs, both for the individual as well as society as a whole. And that very benefit comes up again in the third dimension of sustainability, social sustainability, namely the physical, mental, and social health benefits of cycling. And we have, in fact, 2 entire chapters that are devoted, one chapter is devoted entirely, chapter 3, to 4 public health professors in Australia, wrote that chapter, to the physical, mental, and social health benefits of cycling. And what they found, by the way, in a very comprehensive review of the literature, is that all studies show that the health benefits of cycling in all of these dimensions, physical, mental, and social, far, far, far offset the potential health risks in terms of injury or death from cycling. That's really important in terms of the individual decision to cycle. Cycling is also socially sustainable, and that it's physically possible for most people, not for everybody, but for most people, it's physically possible. Even for some people with disabilities. I have arthritis and back issues, and cycling is my easiest way and most healthiest way to get around. It's also financially affordable for almost everyone, so it's equitable in this sense. So cycling is really sustainable in virtually every dimension you look at. It might make you wonder in this next slide why English-speaking countries, why we, and here in the United States in particular, have such low levels of cycling, but such as great, this perfect mode of transportation for cities. Why do we cycle so little? I mean, it's about 1% roughly in the United States. It's 0.6% of work trips, and it's 1% of all trips altogether, which is a very small percentage. Look at the other ones, you have almost 30%. Look at Japan, 13%, Denmark, 14%. All of those European countries to the right, much, much higher percentages. Looking at the percentages, the ones that are circled there to the left, they are all English-speaking countries, actually. New Zealand, they're not included here in the graph, but New Zealand and Ireland are also roughly this level of 1 to 2%. And lest you think it is, in fact, due to speaking English, that's the cause of this, it's not, because in 1950, the bike mode share in the UK was 12%, which is higher than the current level in Germany. So it's due to policies. It's due to land use policies, transportation policies, as we will see later. And some of you might think, well, maybe it's due to the much longer trip distances in these newer countries, such as the United States, Canada, Australia. Well, that's somewhat true, but it's not the main explanation. So for example, in the United States, 40% of all trips in our very sprawled, car-dependent metropolitan areas, 40% of all trips are 2 miles or shorter. That is a very easy distance to cover by bike. So it's not due to trip distance. Moreover, something that this slide is showing is control for trip distance. Look at within each trip distance category, country by country, and you find that even controlling for trip distance, cycling levels are about 10 times higher. I mean, it varies from trip distance category and country to country, but as you can see for the right 3 countries, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, much, much, much higher levels of cycling than you find in either the United States or the UK. So that's important to note. The hopeful sign here, it's a little bit depressing that here in the sort of North America and Australia and so forth, we have sort of low levels of cycling. But what is very encouraging is that we've had a big increase in cycling. I mean, really a big increase in cycling. What you see here is that in a number of these cities, we have about 15 cities here, which started out roughly in 1990 with extremely low levels of cycling. And then managed to largely increase. And like in the case to the right, you have from 2-fold to 10-fold increases in percentages of trips made by bike. Here in this region, the Washington area, an increase of 7-fold from 0.8% in 1990 to 5.4% in 2017. It's not high enough. 5% is still a lot lower than you have in Amsterdam and Copenhagen, but that is a 7-fold increase. That's what I would call progress. And all of those cities on the right, just to the right of where Washington is, have had major increases, roughly 10 or so fold increases in cycling. Those were Bogota, Colombia, Portland, Vienna, Seville. These were all, even the 3, so 2 of those are European cities, but they had 0 tradition of cycling, and they managed to greatly increase it through policies, by the way, transportation and land use policy and car restrictive policies, importantly. If you look at the cities on the right, what you find there is you have significant increases even in those cities that already had a very high level of cycling. So the 2 most obvious being Amsterdam and Copenhagen. So they already had, as you can see, roughly over 20% of trips by bike. Look at what they did. So you have Copenhagen going up to almost 30%, and you have Amsterdam going to about 36%. That's really impressive to me. Huge increases, maybe not as high as a percentage, but really big increases. So you have a third, or in the case of Copenhagen, well, almost a third of all trips by bike. That's a big improvement. Munich, as well as Berlin, roughly doubled cycling. Again, a big, that's an accomplishment. But look at Frankfurt. Where they usually circled that is it was never a bicycle-friendly city. No one in Germany would ever have considered Frankfurt to be a bicycling-friendly city. And it wasn't until over the past 20 years or so, the city of Frankfurt, under pressure from its citizens, by the way, who threatened in various kinds of public referenda and so forth, but it was explicit. It was a grassroots movement. It was not top down, it was bottom up. And they forced the local government to implement one policy after another, complementary policies, to expand and improve and better connect their bikeway system. And look what happened. You have a fourfold increase. And now all of a sudden, Frankfurt has this goal of becoming the cycling city in Germany. It's like, that's really something. Okay, so anyway, this is a big accomplishment.
We saw some of the potential of bicycling during the COVID pandemic. This graph shows you on the horizontal axis the weeks of the year, and then it compares cycling levels in 2020 during COVID with 2019. Whenever the colorful lines here are above the zero line, it means more cycling in 2020 than in 2019. When it's below, it means less. And we see in general the lines are above that zero line, but we have a big dip here in the beginning of the year around week 14, 15, and 16. This is when many of the countries had severe lockdowns. So people were not allowed to leave their houses. They were only allowed to travel within a certain distance from their home. They were only allowed to travel with a sheet of paper saying where they are going. We had declines in cycling then, but once the lockdowns were lifted, we had increases in bicycling again. Of course, there's a lot of variability by country and by week. Overall, looking at that data, we find increases in cycling during the COVID pandemic, but of course, a lot of variability by month, by time of day, by location, and also by trip purpose. In general, we saw increases for exercise, recreation, getting outdoors, and stress relief. Also what people are saying in surveys. Why did you ride a bike during COVID? Stress relief was a big part there. We saw the largest increases in bicycling on weekends, and the largest increases in terms of facility and off-road recreational paths. At the same time, we had decreases in morning peak hour cycling. These are the people who are not going to work, to school, to university anymore because they are staying at home. And that sort of correlates with a decrease in trips for utilitarian purposes. It's not just that people changed their travel, but also cities changed how they accommodated bicyclists. This is the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, and just before COVID, it was ready to become a bicycle street and saw a lot of bike traffic during COVID. And you can see that on the left, there's still a lane for trucks and for buses, but essentially this car street has become a bicycle street. And now in 2021, they dropped the speed limit almost citywide. A couple of streets are not included in Paris to 30 kilometers per hour. This is the city of Montreal in Canada. They built nearly 70 kilometers of new or improved cycling facilities during 2020. And most of them with physical separation, as we see here, and they feel safe enough for entire families to ride their bikes there. Very common throughout the US are the pictures we see here. The upper right, we have a closed street where pedestrians, cyclists, and inline skaters were given the entire space. On the upper left, we see some of these outdoor dining facilities. A car travel lane has been taken out and a contraflow bike lane was put in. And on the bottom, we see these closed neighborhood streets where there was only local access and drivers had to share the street with pedestrians and cyclists to allow them to use the full width of the street. What also happened in quite a few cities was that bike infrastructure was made permanent. This is an example from Boylston Street in Boston. They put in a pop-up bike lane with these cones that you see there. And there was a lot of demand for this, more demand than we see in this picture, but that's the only picture we have of that phase of Boylston Street. And they then, because of the demand, turned it into a permanent two-way cycle track. And this has been replicated in many, many places. This is an example from Vancouver, Canada on Beach Avenue. You can see the cones there to the right. They saw 10,000 bicyclists on several days in the summer, and now they made this permanent with concrete curbs. So they took out the cones there, put in concrete curbs, and it's still one of the busiest cycling routes. So during COVID, people were riding more and cities made more efforts to accommodate cyclists.
Latin America is a very important part of the world. It often gets neglected in scientific studies of urban transportation. There's been very little research done on urban transportation in Latin America, where we devote an entire chapter to Latin America in the book. And it's co-authored by 3 Latin American colleagues, professors of transportation, of planning, and they collected a unique data set. They've been working on this for, I think, about 15 years, at least 10 years. There are no national travel surveys in Latin America. And so what they were able to collect, though, were city survey data. They're not 100% comparable because each city uses a somewhat different method, but this is the best information available. And what you can see is that there's a huge variation going from virtually 0 in cities, and these are fairly large cities, Lima, Quito, Valparaiso, and so forth, all the way up to 7% in Bogota, Colombia, 8% in Guadalajara, Mexico. So big, big, big variation. One thing that we wanted to point out is what the graph on its own doesn't really show, that there have been big increases in cycling in those Latin American cities that have really invested in cycling and infrastructure and in programs as well, such as we'll talk about later, ciclovías. But look at these are big increases. Bogota is sort of the big winner here, as it were, an 11-fold increase from 0 points, less than 1% to almost 7%. And then you have Santiago de Chile, about a doubling from 2 to 4%. And then Buenos Aires, again, these are major cities from 0.4 to 3.5, so about a 9-fold increase. So tremendous increases in cycling in those Latin American cities that are making the effort, both in terms of infrastructure and programs, to improve cycling. We have also one chapter in the book devoted to the two most populous countries in the world, China and India. This graph on China, by the way, I co-authored this chapter with 3 Chinese colleagues and 2 Indian colleagues. So a lot of this goes, their data collection was essential to this chapter. One of the depressing trends in China, as you will see from this, I need to say, there's no national travel survey in China either. There's just none. And so all you have is city surveys, which again are somewhat incomparable with each other. It's the best information we have. But what you generally see, virtually without exception, is significant and sometimes big declines in cycling in Chinese cities over this period. And it's probably even a bigger decline than what you see. Why? Because some of these cities include e-bikes in the bicycle share. And in China, unfortunately, most e-bikes are not pedelecs. What are classified officially as e-bikes include pedal-less bikes, that is, no pedals at all. So basically sit-down electric scooters. So this, as depressing as this chart is, it doesn't even, it understates the extent to which there's been this decline in cycling in Chinese cities. More important, why this decline? Number one, tremendous economic development in China over the past few decades. Big increases in GDP per capita, increases in per capita income. What has that led to? Big, I mean, really very large increases in car ownership and use. That in turn has led to, or encouraged, the Chinese governments at every level, the central, provincial, and also local levels, to vastly expand the roadway infrastructure, motorways, limited access highways, just taking up a lot of space, some of which used to be devoted to cycling. So in some cases, cycling facilities were either eliminated or narrowed, and on some streets, cycling wasn't allowed. So that's another reason that you have this decrease in cycling. You have a big increase in car use and reduced space for cycling, but also you have a truly massive investment in these Chinese cities in public transportation infrastructure. 6 of these cities are among the 10 largest metro systems in the entire world now. And if you go back, say 30 or 40 years ago, they were not in the top 10 at all. So a truly massive investment in public transportation, and I'm all in favor of that. I'm just saying now we have not only a car competitor to cycling, but also have a much, much better public transport alternative to cycling, so more competition. On top of all that, you also have cities spreading out. These are very rapidly growing cities. So they're growing in population, but also in land area. That means increasing trip distances, which are less easy to cover by bike. The last factor, unfortunately, is, as you probably know, that Chinese cities are among the most polluted in the world in terms of air pollution, which makes cycling also less attractive than it was even a few years ago. Looking at India, another really sort of a mega country in terms of population, roughly 20%, roughly a fifth of all trips in India are by bike. And this is actually of work commuters, so it's percentage of work commuters. So it's roughly 20%, and that's pretty constant. If you go from 100,000 population of a city all the way to 3 million, you have about 21% trips by bike. Then when you go to larger cities, I thought it's a 2 million, not 3, between 2 and 5 million, the percentage goes down to 16%. And then for the largest cities, 5 million plus, it goes down to 9%. Now, why would it be that you would have this big decline? The reason is, well, with a bigger city, you have by far much better public transportation service. Not great, but certainly more public transport services. You have sometimes none in small cities. You also have shorter trip distances in smaller cities, longer trip distances in larger cities, similar to what I was talking about in China. You also have much worse problems of air pollution in the larger Indian cities. So for all of these reasons, you have a decline. You also have higher levels of income in the larger cities, which means more car ownership in the larger cities. So again, more competition. One thing I like to say is all of the cycling in India and China, for practical purposes, it's all utilitarian. The second thing I'd like to just note, in China, there is no gender gap. There's as many women as men cycling in India. In China. In India, there's a humongous gender gap with about 6 or 7 times the percentage of men cycling as by women. Complicated issue as to why, but that is an unfortunate case.
And we also see gender differences in bicycling in other countries. This shows you the share of bike trips made by women. On the left, we see in Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada, only between 1/4 and 1/3 of bike trips are made by women, which compares to about parity in Austria, Germany, Sweden, and Denmark. And then in the Netherlands and Japan, you have 55% about of bike trips made by women. This again just shows you if you look at the cyclists, the high share of bike trips made by women in Denmark and the Netherlands. If we want to promote bicycling, we have to promote it for women and as well as for men, but we also have to promote it for all ages because we can ride bikes at all ages. As you see here in the upper center, we have kids cycling on little tricycles at a very young age. We have kids on the upper right riding to and scooting to school, but you can also ride at an older age, as you see on the lower right there. You may also need a tricycle that then can also allow you to carry cargo and other things, or you can go, as on the lower right, you can go out for a bike ride as an older adult. Bicycling varies by age. This shows you the percentage of trips by bike per age group, and as we see here in the US, in all countries, the highest percentage is always the youngest age group. These are the kids and teenagers who are not at driving age yet, so they can't drive, and they make the highest share of trips by bicycle. And then in the US and the UK, the percentage of trips made by bike sort of falls with age and gets to very low levels, less than 1% once we reach the 70-plus-year-old age group. If we look at Japan and Germany, we see that bicycling share of trips falls once after the youngest age group, but then sort of stays stable around 12% in Japan and around 10% in Germany, even into the oldest age group. In Denmark, there is some decline. We're still at 10% of all trips made by bike for those 70 years and older. And now look all the way to the right at the Netherlands. There we have about 1/4 of all trips, 23% of all trips by those 70 years and older made by bicycle. So we can truly cycle into old age if the conditions are right for that. In the book, we also have a chapter on the fast-paced increase in e-bike sales and e-bicycling in Europe and in the US. Most of the bicycles, the e-bikes here, are pedelecs, so not the ones that John talked about for the Chinese cities, but the bicycles where you pedal, and once you pedal, you get electric support, and their sales have increased a lot. The data here end in 2018. If we were to extend it to today, the growth would be even stronger. During the COVID pandemic, many e-bikes were sold, and all the countries are showing the trend in the same direction. Germany is leading with the most sold e-bikes in this graph here.
Cycling safety is absolutely crucial. It is probably the most important factor that keeps people from riding bikes. There have been many surveys, and that's exactly what all of them find. The people who don't ride bikes mainly don't do it because they're afraid of it. They think it's the traffic risks are just too high. And that view of cycling as being unsafe is especially a deterrent for older adults, for the parents of children, for anyone with disabilities, for anyone who's risk averse. And it turns out survey after survey shows that women, for whatever reason, are more sensitive to safety than men. So it's really crucial to make cycling safer, to make it safer, and also then, once it's safer, to convey the impression, the perception of cycling as having been made safer. The greater safety of cycling in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany is surely one of the most important reasons for the very high level of cycling there. And as you can see from this graph, there's a very close relationship, a very strong statistical relationship between cycling safety and levels of safety. So look at the United States. We're in the worst corner, the corner of shame. We have the least cycling as a percentage of actually cycling in terms of what is kilometers cycled per person per year. So we have the least cycling, and then we have the most dangerous cycling in terms of cycling fatalities per 100 million kilometers cycled. The Netherlands is the corner of praise, I suppose you'd call it, the highest levels of cycling, and it is the very safest cycling in the world. And then you can see the other countries along this line. Well, what's the direction of causation? This surely shows the correlation, but what's the direction of causation? It goes in both directions. So first of all, once a city or country implements safer infrastructure, more connected infrastructure, intersection modifications adapted to cyclists, programs such as better bike training, better training of motorists, which I think is even more crucial than the training of cyclists, training motorists to respect cyclists and to avoid endangering cyclists. Those sorts of infrastructure and policy measures make cycling safer, and the safer cycling then leads to more cycling. So that's one direction of causation. The other direction is the more cycling there is, the safer it becomes. And it's called safety in numbers. That's sort of the concept, safety in numbers. How does that work? Well, for one thing, the more cyclists you have out there on the roadway, or including bike lanes, the more visible cyclists overall become, the more expected they are by motorists. They see cyclists all the time, and they're more ready to respond in a way that doesn't endanger cyclists. For example, at intersections when they're making turns, they're more likely to expect, well, let's see if there's a cyclist there. There's another impact as well, maybe it's even more crucial, and that is, imagine the case of the Netherlands. Well, almost everyone, every motorist in the Netherlands is also a cyclist. That makes a huge difference. It means every motorist is taking into account the needs of cyclists. Motorists in the Netherlands don't find cyclists being there, they don't have the legitimate right to be on the roadway because they're also cyclists. So they identify more with cycling, and they accept it, and they drive in a way that avoids endangering cycling. By the way, they have to do that by law, but also they do it because they are also cyclists. Yet another, one last reason is that the more cyclists you have, the more public and political support you have for implementing those sorts of infrastructure and policy measures to make cycling safer.
Okay, John, we have to speed up a bit.
Okay, I'll do it. Okay, here we have progress. So there are only 5 countries here because these are the only 5 countries that we could find that had national travel surveys over time, which measure then million kilometers of cycling. We can see here over these 3 time periods, which you can see up above in the legend, tremendous improvement in cycling safety. So basically a tripling in cycling safety in the UK, you have a doubling in cycling safety in Germany and in Denmark, and roughly a 60% increase in cycling safety in the Netherlands. Now, look at the United States. We are not in a good position here. There had been progress between 2000, 2010 or so, but now we've backtracked terribly. Cycling, as well as walking, by the way, have become much more dangerous on a per kilometer basis. Why? Well, number one, we have more vehicle kilometers traveled, more motor vehicle kilometers traveled over this more recent time period. Number two, we have larger and larger motor vehicles. In particular, personal motor vehicles are now overwhelmingly huge pickup trucks or minivans or SUVs. And we looked at a number of studies and all of them agree, the larger the vehicle, the more dangerous it is for the cyclist and also for the pedestrian. Another factor involved here is in the United States, in contrast to these other countries, there's been a big increase in drunk driving. There's been a big increase in speeding, exceeding the speed limits, and our speed limits in the United States are higher, our urban speed limits, higher than in these European countries at any rate. And now we even have a higher rate of speeding. On top of all that, there is truly an epidemic of distracted driving in the United States, whether it's due to texting, cell phone use, you name it, one distraction after another. It's no wonder in a way, but the real point here is these are all really not the fault of cyclists. It's the fault of the motorists or the motor vehicles on the roadways that are making cycling and walking more dangerous. It's not the fault of the pedestrians or the cyclists. So, but overall, we're certainly, we need to do much better here in the United States. There's just no excuse for this backtracking and having cycling become worse. Okay, we have one entire chapter that compares cycling in New York, London, and Paris, three very important cities in the world, as you all know. Big improvements here. So from roughly 1990 to 2017, we have a roughly a tripling 3.5-fold increase in cycling in New York. We have a doubling in London, and we have the winter years, a 12-fold increase in cycling in Paris. Not 100% comparable because Paris is it's a city of Paris, and unlike the city of New York and London, it doesn't include as large a percentage of the metro area. But so huge, a 12-fold increase. That is really impressive. At the same time, confirming the graph we saw earlier, this correlation between cycling levels and cycling safety, you have in every one of these cities tremendous improvement, big reductions in levels of serious injuries as well as fatalities, cyclist fatalities and serious injuries compared to levels of cycling. So this does not say that total injuries or total fatalities have fallen, but rather the fatalities and injuries compared to levels of cycling have fallen. In short, cycling has become much safer in all three of these cities. And this is one of the ways it's happened. There's more and more, much more emphasis now on providing physically separated cycling facilities. Some people call them cycle tracks, protected bike lanes, cycleways, bikeways, all sorts of different names depending on the city. But as you can see, in each of these cases, the cyclists are physically separated from motor vehicles. In addition, if you look at the New York photo, what also is important there is it shows an intersection. This is 8th Avenue going south, I believe, or 9th Avenue, 8th Avenue, I think it's going south. At any rate, you can see at that intersection, there's the lights are timed so that there's a green light for the cyclists to go ahead to proceed to the intersection. And there's a no left turn light for the motorist. Because the intersections are really crucial. You've got to deal with improving cycling safety in the intersections, either prohibit turns or have these specially phased lights so that when the cyclists are going through, there are no right or left turning motorists.
So how can we encourage more cycling while improving the safety? John already alluded to the importance of cycling facilities. Traffic calming is another important policy to reduce speed limits and volumes in neighborhoods. We'll talk about that in a little while, but also mixed-use zoning and improved urban design to keep distances short enough and make roadways safe for cyclists. Integration with public transportation to allow for longer trip distances. Restrictions on motor vehicle use, and that's speed and access. Improve traffic education for motorists, but also for cyclists. Have traffic regulations that protect cyclists and enforce those. And then, of course, special events and other promotional campaigns. This graph here shows you about 20 cities in Europe, North, South America, and I think also in Australia. And they all have increased the supply of bikeway facilities. These are bike lanes and bike paths over the time period shown there. And at the same time, they've all seen growth in bicycling. There's a lot of variability, mainly because of the level of bikeways the city had before and the cycling levels where they started at. But what's important is all of these cities have reduced the fatalities and severe injuries relative to those cycling levels. Cycling has gotten safer per bike trip or per kilometer cycled in all of these cities. One of the measures, as John said, are protected bike lanes or cycle tracks. This is the supply in the United States, about a 14-fold increase from 2006 to 2018. And if we had newer data, we would see an even stronger and continuous increase in those facilities. Now, what do they look like? They look slightly differently in different places. On the upper left, we have Copenhagen If you look in the center there, you'll see next to the pink car in the back, you see a little curb. That's a curb separating the roadway from the cycle track. And there will be another curb separating that cycle track from the pedestrians. On the right, we have Bogota, Colombia, and you have these yellow caps there that are protecting the two-way cycle track from motorized traffic. Montreal, the city in North America that was the first to have a network of protected bike lanes, they're using these concrete curbs. You see that to the left. In Seville, Spain, on the right-hand side, they're using a fence to protect cyclists from motorized traffic. This here is from Vancouver in Canada, and it gives you a sense of the feeling as a cyclist before and after the installation of a cycle track. So before the cyclist is in traffic, and after we have the planters that separate cyclists from motorized vehicles, and it gives you a very different safety situation, a very different perception of safety to riding your bike there. These are pictures from Australia and Sydney and in Brisbane. Again, we see the cycle tracks separated from the roadway. We also see women cycling. We see children cycling. In the upper left, we have a bridge that's very important because often waterways, highways build barriers for cyclists that they cannot cross. And if we are providing bridges or at least access for cyclists, we can facilitate bicycling there. Many cyclists are not willing to cycle across a bridge with high volumes and fast motorized traffic because there's no way to go. If a car gets too close to you, there's a wall or there's a railing. So bridges are very, very important. A new trend we identified are so-called bicycle expressways. Here we have an example on the upper left from Freiburg, Germany. Typically on these bicycle expressways, pedestrians and cyclists are separated to facilitate faster cycling. But more importantly, at intersections with roadways, you either have a tunnel or you have a bridge. And what that does is two things. First, it removes the danger of having to cross that roadway, so it's safer for cycling. And second, it removes the waiting at the intersection because you can go under or above on the bridge or the tunnel, so it makes cycling faster. In fact, it's so fast that on the upper left here, we see the blue sign they're using there in Freiburg. In Germany, it's the same sign they use, the same color they use for the Autobahn, which suggests fast car travel. So this suggests fast bike travel. At the bottom there, we have Beijing, China, a elevated bicycle expressway that's above the roads and above the city. Sort of one of the efforts from what John had mentioned before of bringing bicycling back in Chinese cities is this separated express bikeway. In the US, we have things planned, and we have similar bicycle expressways. For example, in the Raleigh, from Raleigh to Chapel Hill, the planned Triangle Bikeway, as we can see here, will be a bicycle expressway. We have US 36 Bikeway connecting Denver to Boulder. That's similar to a bicycle expressway. We have the Custis Trail in Arlington, where my work is, that is next to Route 66. That's a little bit like a bicycle expressway. And we have the I-90 Trail in Seattle, Washington, next to I-90 with a similar function to a bicycle expressway. But much more common in the US are situations that we see here. On the left, we have the Cherry Creek Trail in Denver, which has some sections where pedestrians and cyclists are separated, but at the rest of the network they are together on that trail. We have the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis, where pedestrians are to the right of that white line we see there and cyclists are to the left. And then even more common in the US is the Minuteman Trail there in Boston, where cyclists and pedestrians are mixed. This shows you a bikeway that was built in California, in Santa Barbara, where they took out two car travel lanes, to build a very nice separated bikeway and a walkway for pedestrians to the right. Another example here, this is from Chicago. You can see the downtown right there. This is the Lakefront Trail. It's 18 miles long, more than 100,000 users on typical summer weekends. And importantly, this is not just for commuters, but it's not just for recreation, but it's also for commuters going to work and coming from work from downtown. Also importantly, on that very trail, they have this flyover that connects two parts of the trail and allows cyclists to avoid congested and dangerous intersections at Grand and Illinois Avenue. We have also bikeways here in Arlington, where my office is located. We see there the end of the Custis Trail where it meets the Mount Vernon Trail, and we see separated bike lanes, protected bike lanes there in Arlington.
Well, since I'm located here in Raleigh, I'm going to give a plug for the Research Triangle area because we have one of the best, if not the best, system of greenways in the United States. Over 300 miles already, and many, many more planned. This has been a very popular thing, these off-road greenways. Sometimes some go through cities, some go sort of around cities or near cities, but they've been extraordinarily popular. They're by far the most heavily used cycling facilities throughout the South. And the next slide shows that as well. You can see in Georgia as well. Here we have examples from North Augusta, from Atlanta, from Chattahoochee, I think it's called, but there in Georgia. One of the problems that you find, as you can see on the Atlanta Beltline, a very, very famous off-road trail, is you have pedestrians and cyclists, and they're not explicitly separated, which creates certain conflicts, and the conflicts get worse and worse as the gets more and more crowded. And during the COVID, I guess it was from April to July of last year, 2020. Also, the greenways here in Raleigh were very overcrowded. So one solution, as you widen the greenway, you increase the supply, but you also need to provide measures to separate cyclists from pedestrians whenever possible. But it's a very, very big and important measure, these greenways in all of the South and in other parts of the United States as well, but I think especially here in the South. Ralph?
New focus in building bikeways is on intersections. And this is an import from the Netherlands to Salt Lake City. And this is sort of a satellite shot taken from Google Maps. And these protected Dutch-style intersections work with these things that we dub safety islands here. What they do is the following. If a motor vehicle starts into the intersection, the safety island does not allow them to make a quick right-hand turn. They have to travel into the center of the intersection and then make the turn. What that does is two things. First, it increases the visibility of cyclists that are coming along on the cycle track there, and it reduces the speed of the motorists. So if there is a crash, the crash is of less impact than a crash at a higher speed, and because cars are so slow, crashes can be avoided altogether. It also shortens the crossing distance of the cyclist across the roadway, having less exposure to motorized traffic. Once the cyclists are crossed, they can go straight, or they can start queuing here for a green light to make a two-stage left turn then. And so if you take all of these things together, the intersections and the bikeways, this is the bike path and lane network in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And you see everything in red there are bikeways and bike lanes. If you look closely, there's some orange there. These are the planned bikeways and bike lanes. And then of course, on top of that, you have all the little streets you see in the back. They are traffic calm to a low car travel speed where motorists and cyclists can share the roadway. So this is a true network for cycling for everyone. And keep in mind, Amsterdam has not always been that way. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Amsterdam, like many cities in the West, went towards promoting automobiles. And here we see the same street in 71 and 2002. And in 71, the street is given to the cars. There's some bikes sort of pushed to the side, and you can almost see how bad the air quality is there in the picture, though it may also be the picture quality. But on the right-hand side, you see the street today. It's a street for bicycles and for pedestrians, and motorized traffic cannot enter there or can only enter there for deliveries at certain times of day. We, of course, know changes in infrastructure in even a shorter time span here in the US as well. This is the transformation of East Boulevard in Charlotte to a complete street, accommodating bicyclists, taking out car travel lanes, putting in bike lanes, putting in crosswalks for pedestrians, etc. Many cities, not just in North America, are trying to follow Amsterdam's example. This graph here shows you Portland, Oregon on top and Seville, Spain at the bottom. In Portland, we see in black their bikeway network in 1990. And in the background, you'll notice the sort of salmon color, pinkish color, yellow color. And the more red this color will get over time as we progress, the more bike commuting there is. At the bottom, we have Seville in 2005. And in green, we have their bikeway network, which is almost non-existent. Advancing a decade in Portland, we see how their bikeway network has grown, the black lines, and how much more bike commuting there is with the colors that are sort of popping out. In Seville, a truly amazing transformation in only 3 years in growing a bikeway network of cycle tracks. Another 15 years in Portland, we see the network for bikeways has gotten ever denser and bike commuting has increased more and more. And about 10 years in 2017 in Seville, we see how their bikeway network has grown and has gotten more and more dense. So they're on their way towards becoming what Amsterdam already is.
Over 95% of cyclist and pedestrian fatalities are due to crashes with motor vehicles. So it is absolutely crucial to reduce the speed of motor vehicles, especially in residential neighborhoods. This is a graph from the World Health Organization, sort of everyone's probably seen it, but what it shows is there's a crucial sort of a threshold here, 30 kilometers per hour, roughly 20 miles an hour, when there's a crash between a pedestrian and a car. Going faster than that, the risk, the probability that the pedestrian will be killed goes up exponentially to the point that at about 35 miles per hour, there's like a 95% chance the pedestrian will be killed. So reducing speed is crucial. This is showing it for pedestrians. We looked everywhere. There was no comparable graph for cyclists because it's just more complicated to calculate. But what key here is absolutely crucial to reduce motor vehicle speeds. Next. One way to do it is you traffic calm residential neighborhoods. This has been one of the most important techniques. I think it's even more important than separate cycling infrastructure because it's been an area-wide throughout entire neighborhoods. 30 kilometer per hour speed limit, that's the standard throughout Europe. It's area-wide, it's not just one street or the other, because then you get these rat-running motorists who are trying to avoid the one street that's traffic calmed. It has to be area-wide and comprehensive and coordinated. What this particular example, which is Freiburg in Germany, the one way you do it is you narrow the street. So in this way, in this particular case, you see it narrows it, especially at the opening, at the entrance to the street. It forces the cars to slow down. And very often you will have one-way traffic for cars and two-way traffic for cyclists. In fact, in Freiburg and Münster and many German cities, almost all of these traffic calm neighborhoods are one way for cars, two ways for cyclists. And there was no increase in cycling injuries or fatalities as a result of allowing two-way cycling. And just this is very typical. 80% of all Dutch streets are traffic calmed. Sorry for getting excited about that, but consider that 80% of all Dutch streets are traffic calmed, roughly 50% of German streets. But even in places like the UK, with that low level of cycling, but London, Greater London has been doing a lot to promote cycling and to reduce car use and reduce car speeds and to traffic calm residential neighborhoods. They call them low traffic neighborhoods, LTNs. The speed limit is 20 miles per hour. They also use miles, not kilometers. And they also then make through traffic almost impossible for motorists. And this is an example here where the car simply cannot go beyond that point. You can see the narrowing of the road, the surface of the road changes somewhat. And with cyclists, of course, can go in either direction. It's only cars that can't. So that's made a big difference in London. Another way you can deter through traffic. So one aspect of traffic calming is don't let through traffic in residential neighborhoods. And one way you do it is through diverters, such as these ones in Quebec City, ones in Montreal here in this photo. But that's very easy to do. And you get pass-throughs or cut-throughs for the cyclists. So it's not a problem for cyclists. It's still perfectly able to get through, but it's impossible for through traffic, for motor vehicle traffic to get through. And this is an example of all places in Indianapolis. I wouldn't have expected this in Indianapolis, but shared streets have become actually more and more common in the United States. In this case, you have a 20 mile per hour speed limit, and you have a sharing of pedestrians, cyclists, as well as motor vehicles. And it's been extremely successful. It is in Indianapolis, not in Portland or some extravagant city you might think it would be in. Next.
Here we have an example, and there should be a video that plays. Let me see if I can run it. This is a shared street in Vienna, in Austria. And what you can see here is that it's a major shopping street. Pedestrians, cyclists, and cars are sharing this space. There is no car parking. There is some parking marked to the right, but it's only for drop-off and for pickup. And cars have to yield to the other users of the street, as we can see with the cars sort of sneaking through there. The maximum speed limit is 20 kilometers per hour, maybe 14 miles per hour. but because cannot go that speed because they have to yield to other modes of transportation. Yet another way of having a shared street and sharing this space between pedestrians, cyclists, scooters, etc., and motorized traffic at a very low speed, though. Getting close towards the end of the presentation, there are, of course, many other measures that help promote bicycling. Two of them are here: bike transit integration and bike parking. Bike transit integration typically takes two ways mainly. One is allowing bicycles on vehicles, like on the upper right in Minneapolis, bicycle on buses. I think 80% of all buses in the US now have these bike racks in front. Or like on the lower left in Vancouver, allowing bicycles on train vehicles. Often this is restricted to certain hours, or it's restricted to certain cars on the train. The second element is bike parking at public transport stops. We have Washington, DC, the bike parking garage at Union Station, the one in Freiburg and in Groningen in this picture are also at major train stations. It can be for free, as it is in Groningen. It also can be for pay, as we have there in Freiburg and in DC. This guarantees protection from theft. And of course, all of them provide protection from the weather. Bike parking is also important throughout the city. At the bottom there, we have a picture of bike parking corrals in Portland, where 2 car parking spots were taken out for about 20 car parking spots in front of businesses. And in the lower right hand, we have sort of a bike parking robot in Nagoya in Japan, where you enter the bicycle into the machine. They either go up or they go down. They store your bike, and you can retrieve the bike with that computer on the right. Other measures to promote cycling include things like ciclovías, where roadways are closed for certain hours, certain days, certain weekends, certain weeks, certain months for motorized traffic. And it gives people a sense of how to use the roadway space if you wouldn't use it for moving and storing motor vehicles. And it gives a sense of what the space could be used for people. Bike sharing has been very successful in attracting new riders to bicycling, especially those that do not want to worry about maintenance. They don't want to worry about theft. They may not have space to store a bike. They may live up a couple of flights of stairs and they don't want to carry the bike. So it was able to attract different riders. We have Bike to Work Day in the US every May, but there are also other programs by employers to try to entice cyclists to ride their bike to work and during a certain event and then keep riding throughout the year. There are also Bike to School days, of course, for children. Training is very important. We have to train children on how to learn to ride a bike. In Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, it's part of the curriculum in 3rd grade about where kids learn in the classroom first and then they learn on the roadway. In the US, in most places, it's still voluntary to do that. DC is the first state, in quotation marks, that requires that in 2nd grade, I think it is. Of course, training for adults is very important, especially in places where adults haven't ridden for a long time. They may not feel comfortable riding a bike. They may want to learn about the rules of the road and how to ride a bike again. Training motorists is very important, and in particular, training motorists to know the rules of the road as they pertain to cyclists and pedestrians, to avoid endangering them and to watch out for them and protect them in traffic. Many cities use benchmarking, so they have reports where they collect data on bikeways, the extent, on cycling levels, on bike crashes, etc. And they use that to benchmark and over time to document progress in making cycling safer, increasing cycling levels, and having more bikeway infrastructure.
Hold on, folks, we're almost finished. I'm going to really speed this up. Okay, so implementation is crucial. We devote 3 full chapters of the book to implementing the necessary policies, programs, and infrastructure. You can have the best ideas in the world, the best plans, the best designs. If you cannot implement them, they are useless. You really need to advertise widely the benefits of cycling, both to the individual as well as to society. You need to include citizen participation as a key to every stage of making bike plans. Another crucial thing is including disincentives for car use. One of those being reduced car speeds, traffic calming of residential neighborhoods, reduced car parking, increased parking costs, and so forth. The bike advocacy is crucial. We have one whole chapter devoted to bicycling advocacy, which helps generate that public and political support to get the necessary things implemented. And that also includes building alliances with politicians and sustainability advocates of various kinds. Now to the conclusions, and I will be very short. First, safe cycling infrastructure is absolutely crucial. It is necessary. You have to have safe cycling infrastructure. You've got to have a safe place to cycle. It could be a traffic calm street without actually special infrastructure. It could be a protected bike lane or an unprotected bike lane. It could be an off-road greenway, but you have to have that cycling infrastructure as a prerequisite. But it's not enough. It's not sufficient. You need programs and policies to complement the infrastructure. And you just saw the whole list of those that Ralph just presented of the various range of policies and programs. And one of the crucial ones, again, being restrictions on car use. Last point, and that is we need to make cycling for everyone. It's a matter of equity and social justice, I think. We need to have infrastructure designed for all ages and abilities, not just for fast racing cyclists for sure, and certainly not just for young men. They should be low stress, even for people who are risk averse or vulnerable. And I'm risk averse, so I want low stress infrastructure. I'm also 70 years old, so I'm up there in the older age group as well. We also have to have special programs to attract non-cyclists, to encourage them to try out cycling, and to help them. Maybe to have sort of groups that are just getting now back into cycling or cycling for the first time, those older adult training programs that Ralph mentioned before. And in the planning process itself, so sort of part of the citizen participation, you really need to include a wide range of groups in that planning process. Otherwise, it's just not going to be successful because you need to have citizen participation, public involvement to make sure whatever is done is accepted by the society as a whole. That's it, folks. Believe it or not, we are at the end. So if you want to know more about this, this is the book, it's MIT Press, and actually it says here $30, but at least on Amazon, it's now with $26, so you get a big discount. Anyway, thank you so much to every single one of you for staying on this long, and we're just so sorry that we went over. It's just so much information. So thanks to all of you. Now we're ready for questions.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can, and all the ones that we can't get through, we'll share with you and you all can follow up later, but I'd encourage people to put the questions in the Q&A box. I am only going to pull them from the Q&A box because there was a lot of conversation in the chat box, so there's a lot to scroll through. So lack of bike and parking facilities is a big impediment to increasing cycling in American cities. Even dense cities have inconsistent bike rack coverage at destinations, and storage space in apartment buildings and other multifamily housing is very rare. What are some promising policies or strategies for increasing bike parking and storage facilities in cities?
The various ways cities can increase bicycling. I mean, one of the obvious ones is to include, and many cities already do that, to include the requirement for new buildings to at a certain size to have bike parking. This can be residential buildings with zoning, or it can be commercial buildings that require that. And you can even require bike cages in buildings. You can require showers for cyclists and lockers in that. There can also be requirements for parking garages to have a certain percentage of the cars parked there also supplied as bike parking. Let's say you have 100 car parking spots, you have to supply 20% bicycle parking spots. Other elements, and that's much harder, is to sort of retrofit residential areas. An interesting approach we have seen in Germany, and I think also in some Dutch cities, is in neighborhoods to provide bike parking sheds. Like the city of Hamburg, for example, in Germany has these bike parking sheds they put outside of houses that were built 100, 150 years ago, and you can obtain a key and you can park 5 to 10 bicycles in these sheds. And so it's close to your home. You don't have to bring them in. You don't have to put them in the basement. You may not be able to get them upstairs, but these bike parking sheds that are supplied throughout the neighborhood can help increase bike parking supply in those areas.
But also, I would just note that as you showed a picture, Ralph, many Dutch, German, Danish cities and so forth have, especially in residential areas, but also in commercial areas, have simply eliminated, they've taken out car parking and converted it into bicycle parking, and you get 20 bike parking spaces for 1 car parking space. So that's another measure.
Great.
Next question.
Our next question is, how can we push, let me take the next one. What is your recommendation for helping educate motorists about cycling to increase safety and for, in general, increasing the number of cycling trips?
If it were up to me, I would ask the federal government to, I'm not sure if they're allowed to do this actually, to impose a requirement that every state include in their motor vehicle training manual and their testing to get a new license, to get a license, a substantial portion to how do you drive in order to avoid endangering cyclists and pedestrians. Here in North Carolina, I mean, I did have to take the test in order to, when I moved from New Jersey here 7 years ago, I don't know if there was a single question about driving to avoid endangering pedestrians and cyclists. It's just, it varies from state to state, but I find far too little emphasis in motorist training and also in motorist testing. In addition to which, I think there's been really lax enforcement on the part of police. I have not one single time seen a police officer ticket a motorist here in the Raleigh area anyway, for violating the legal rights of cyclists or pedestrians. A pedestrian and a cyclist almost run over by a car and the police just don't do anything. It was the same thing in New Jersey. And New Jersey has truly homicidal motorists. They're not quite as homicidal here in Raleigh, but wow. Okay, Ralph, what do you think?
I think education is very, very important. Teaching motorists when they get the license how to watch out for pedestrians and cyclists, enforce that during the testing for them. And this includes making a routine look over your right-hand shoulder before making a right-hand turn. It makes a routine look over your left-hand shoulder before you open a car door, and it should just be a normal process of doing it. And then also awareness campaigns for motorists about not being distracted, about not drinking and driving, about not speeding. And I see that lacking in many places, especially now as it's getting dark in the evenings. There's a lot of safety campaigns around pedestrians and cyclists, but it's putting the onus on pedestrians and cyclists. It tells the pedestrian, wear bright clothing, but the campaign should also be motorists. If you can't see well, drive more slowly. So I think the education component should also include these campaigns geared at motorists to drive more defensively and more responsibly.
Great.
Also, every single police officer.
Oh, John, your sound is cutting out. I'm not sure what's going on. Any recommendations for working with state departments of transportation who own and manage roads running through cities that do not feature active transportation infrastructure? We run up against their LOS policies that prioritize vehicle traffic flow.
It's a very difficult question, and what to do about agencies that are more thinking about vehicle movement, especially state DOTs that are often not even thinking about urban areas or areas in towns and villages, but they're thinking about moving vehicles across state. The main thing we have found is that over time, and it may not really help the person who asked the question, is developing relationships with those agencies, getting into communication with them, and changing things sort of bit by bit in a very slow one after the other process, but we don't have any golden bullet or golden solution there.
All right, our next question is, how can we push federal and state design standards into the 21st century as long as design guides recommend poor infrastructure, local communities will default to the inadequate?
I mean, the US is actually doing quite well on that already in pushing with the NACDO design standards that we have that are sort of pushing the outdated, old-fashioned, often not in science-based AASHTO guidelines. AASHTO is still the main go-to place for many engineers, but NACDO has made big inroads. Federal Highways and US DOT have said that NACDO and AASHTO can be used. And I was on the committee reviewing the AASHTO guide that still hasn't been released on bikeways, and that's coming a long way from the AASHTO guide of the 2000s that even told you, well, never have any bike facility at an intersection. The bikeways used to end 20 yards before the intersection of good luck, we see you on the other side. That's what AASHTO had promoted. It's ridiculous, but they've been pushed, and they're being pushed even more. And I think NACDO is doing very, very well in that. And then by having the practice of implementing those more innovative measures, we get data behind that, and we see that the data that AASHTO based their standards on is often non-existent or is wrong. So I think the US is on a good way. and they're doing very well in pushing the envelope here.
I think we have also a really good question here. I think you all spoke of several large cities in your study, and so we have a question that says, what lessons can smaller US cities take from a lot of your case studies?
Actually, some of the cities in the United States with the highest bicycle share of trips are in fact some of the smaller or medium-sized cities. Boulder, Colorado, Davis, California, Madison, Wisconsin, Cambridge, Massachusetts. There are a number of towns. I mean, the highest bike mode share here in North Carolina is in Chapel Hill, partly because of the University of North Carolina. So I think a lot of medium and smaller sized towns have done a very good job. And also one of the reasons is they have probably, in many cases, less traffic. So it's maybe less intimidating to ride a bike. They might have shorter trip distances. So it's we showed the big cities because those are the cities for which we had the data. It's a little bit more difficult to show the data for smaller cities because they don't have enough sample cases to yield reliable estimates of the level of cycling. But if you look at cities such as Boulder or Eugene, Oregon, or I mean, they're all over the place. They've done a very good, some of them have done a very good job, and they have huge potential. And I will just refer back to that case of India, where it's the smaller cities and rural areas that have the highest level of cycling. And I think here in the United States, the smaller cities, the ones that are more compact, would also have shorter trip distances and also a lot of potential for cycling.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. I think the lower traffic volumes are great in more rural areas, especially in the residential areas. Of course, you have the main streets with more volume and higher speeds, but you can have lower traffic speeds and volumes on neighborhood streets. You have to figure out what to do about these main streets or these larger arterials. Then one important aspect though is also access. Like cyclists have to go somewhere or have to reach destinations. So maybe that's also a way to sort of planning your network or planning your bikeways from the destinations where people may want to go. We found in many European smaller towns that cycling levels are quite high because trip distances are shorter. As John said, they can go to a local supermarket or they can go to a local library or other destinations on neighborhood streets and may not have to get onto the larger roadways. And of course, then some of the guides, like the new AASHTO guide, they have sections on cycling in rural areas or along rural roadways.
Mm-hmm. And we were surprised looking at the data for Germany, for example. We had very detailed data, and we had thought that cycling levels would drop off sharply, as they do in the United States, as you go further from the center. And in fact, many of the suburbs and towns in the outer area really did have as high a bike mode share as in the center of the city, but that was due to explicit policies. Those suburbs actually come equipped or build those cycling facilities. So unlike if you look at most American suburbs or rural areas, there's very little in the way of cycling facilities. So part of it, the reason those cycling levels in suburbs and sort of exurbs in Germany or the Netherlands or Denmark are so high, it really is explicit government intervention to provide those safer cycling facilities.
Well, I want to say thank you as we approach 1:15 to John and to Ralph. We have a number of other questions that we just don't have time to get to, but I'm going to share that list of questions with both of you. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this webinar is recorded like all of our others, and it can be found on our YouTube page, which is linked at virginia.planning.org. But as always, all of our registrants will get an email once this webinar is posted later today with a link to the webinar, a recap of the webinar, the CM credit number, and contact information for our presenters if you have follow-up questions for them. So we will share all of that information so they can answer all the questions we didn't get to, which we knew that was gonna happen, didn't we? Again, thank you to Hannah and APA North Carolina for helping us coordinate this. And again, to both of our presenters and to everyone who joined us today. And we will see you again next month. Remember, a week early for information about the 2020 census. And we, again, just thank you for joining us, and we will see you next month. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Very much.